This is MEELive's Deep Dive, where we dive into a story shaking up the world. Germany's new Chancellor got off to a shaky start this week after failing to secure the necessary votes in his first test of parliamentary approval, an unprecedented failure in post-war German history. But after a successful second bid, Friedrich Merz took his seat on Tuesday as head of Europe's largest economy. He comes from the same centre-right Christian Democratic Union Party, or CDU, as Angela Merkel, Germany's longest-standing chancellor. But Merz's ascent marks a swing to the right by the party. Before being elected, Merz broke a long-standing taboo in German politics by leaning on the far-right party in a failed bid to push through anti-migrant policy, a taboo that dates back to the fall of the Nazis, who led a genocidal dictatorship under Adolf Hitler until their defeat in World War II 80 years ago today. This same legacy accounts for Germany's loyal bond to Israel, many of whose Jewish population fled Hitler's murderous campaign to find sanctuary in a land they were promised would bring security. But this promise failed to account for the land's pre-existing Palestinian population who have been displaced, starved, and killed en masse in the name of its fulfillment. Merz has steered into this historic alliance in the face of mounting evidence of Israeli war crimes, iterating Germany's unconditional support. And before coming to power, he promised to host Israeli leader Benjamin Netanyahu, despite an International Criminal Court warrant out for his arrest. Germany is an ICC member. Despite Merz's shift to the right, he turned towards the centre for his coalition partner, striking a tentative agreement with the centre-left SDU. The fragility of that partnership became apparent, though, in this week's vote. And it echoes the fragile nature of politics across the West, with growing polarisation, authoritarianism, and what progressives condemn as a rollback of minority rights across much of the region. So what does Friedrich Merz mean for the Middle East, migration, and the makeup of Western politics? To answer this, I spoke earlier this afternoon to renowned journalist and author John Campner in Berlin. John Campner, welcome to MEELive. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Merz lost the first round of votes to confirm his role earlier this week, a pretty rare occurrence and a betrayal by unknown members of his own coalition ranks. Can you quickly tell us what happened?
It was astonishing, and it was the first time, the only time it's ever happened in the history of the Federal Republic of post-war Germany. Everybody was there, even Merz's Christian Democrat predecessor, Angela Merkel, was there watching those two don't get on, but it was a sort of seen as a gesture of reconciliation. His family was there, everybody was there, and he had a whole day of rituals worked out. All his government ministers were going to be confirmed in post. And then, hey presto, he lost, and he failed by some margin. It turned out that 18 members of both his party, the Christian Democrats, and the party they're going into coalition with, the Social Democrats, had voted against him and against the coalition. It was a secret ballot, so we'll never know who did it and who were the so-called guilty parties. And it was pretty much chaos ensued. Who's running the country? Is Olaf Scholz, the outgoing chancellor, still running it for a few more days? What's going to happen? Anyway, a few hours later, lots of hand-wringing, lots of arm twisting, and deals behind the scenes. They did have another vote, and he was comfortably confirmed in his position. In one sense, it's a total blot on his copybook, even before he has started. On the other, you could look at it slightly more benignly and say that he's got a reputation, and it's more than a reputation, it's true, for being a pretty acerbic, difficult character. Will this sort of jolt him into understanding that politics has to be a little bit more collegiate, a little bit more emotionally intelligent than sometimes he shows? And will he learn from that also that he's got a lot of work to do to get legislation through to change the country to make sure this coalition is stable?
Thank you. One of the things that we want to understand about what this new Chancellor means for the world is what he means regarding the conflict in Israel and Gaza. Earlier on today's show, we heard Israel's Security Cabinet has approved plans for the conquest of Gaza. In the past, Merz has iterated unconditional support from Germany to Israel. Will anything make him waver in his support for Israel? And what is that support likely to look like?
Frankly, I don't think it will, but I don't think it's particularly an issue that has his stamp on it. Germany, after the war, saw, with the whole issue of what's called memory culture, and another German term which means, and I'll use the German, Vergangenheitsbewältigung, which basically means coming to terms, dealing with your history. So Germany has always reserved a special place because of its Nazi past for Israel. However, it was also critical in the past. What happened in 2007 was that Merkel went to the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, and declared that the survival and the prosperity of Israel was part of Germany's reason of state. In other words, it was inviolable. Nothing could be done to challenge that. And so after October the 7th, the line, I think, that really struck most with many Germans, particularly the politicians, was that this was the single biggest killing of Jews anywhere since the Holocaust on a single day. And that, of course, in a country that feels very fragile about this subject, struck home. Now, what then happened was that Netanyahu deciding to go on the rampage, pretty much obliterating Gaza and all the issues that are, to put it mildly, questionable in international law. Successive German governments, Olaf Scholz's last government, and this one, will have sort of been forced to adopt an approach towards Netanyahu of hear no evil, speak no evil, and conflating criticism of Netanyahu with anti-Semitism. This isn't where a lot of German public opinion is, but it's a sort of issue that, unlike the Ukraine war, where the Germans are kind of almost quite comfortable in picking who they regard as the perpetrator, the Russians, and the victims, the Ukrainians, they would almost wish the Gaza conflict and everything that's happening would go away. So I think you will hear forthright support for Israel from Merz, but at the same time, he will be desperately hoping it doesn't define his government.
It is true that Merz's position on Israel is largely in keeping with Germany's historic legacy, but Germany is also a member of the International Criminal Court, and Merz did ruffle some feathers within his own parliament when he declared shortly after the election that he would basically deny the ICC arrest warrant out for Netanyahu's arrest and make sure Netanyahu has a state visit to Germany without being arrested. Is he likely to follow through with this?
It's such an interesting question, and if he does, and if Netanyahu does come to Germany, I think it will be incendiary in the sense that there will be demonstrations, the likes of which, there are already pretty big demonstrations on this issue, but I think they will be unprecedented in their vehemence and in their size. At the same time, as you point out, it puts Germany at loggerheads with the court, and Germany absolutely, alongside, in a sense, its position is contradictory. It sees its support for Israel as inviolable, but it also, Germany loves to tell people all the time that the one thing on which the whole raison d'etre of this country post-Nazi era stands on is adherence to the rule of law. So how does Germany reconcile itself with that? I get the sense that the Germans will kick that can down the road and will do everything they can for that situation, for them not to be confronted by that situation.
Now, within Germany, the AfD, Alternative for Deutschland Party, is a growing force. It did surprisingly well maybe not surprisingly well, but shockingly well in terms of historic precedent in the general election earlier this year. Campner, in some of your literature not that long ago, you demonstrated how unlikely it seemed that the far right would ever return to mainstream politics in Germany in the wake of the Nazis. But that is, of course, happening, and not without controversy. Last week, a over 1,000-page report by domestic intelligence just, classified the group as an extremist group on the basis of it being, quote, racist and anti-Muslim. That raised debates about whether to ban the party. Just today, that decision was suspended. But I think it goes to show how much of a threat this incoming group poses to the sort of fabric of German politics. Can Merz contain this rising tide of far-right sentiment, particularly given the fraught start to his chancellorship?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I would say is that I don't believe there is anything particularly German about the rise of the far-right or the alt-right. Britain has, in Reform UK, a party running roughly at the same amount, 25, 27, 28%. In France, the National Rally under Marine Le Pen is doing extremely well and is knocking on the door of power. You could do a tour d'horizon of all of Europe, and we're not even talking about the United States and Donald Trump, where parties are either in power or are very close to power or are sharing power. So it is everywhere, this populist resurgence on the far right. The German system means that coalitions are required everywhere, both in national politics and in regional politics in the 16 states. So far, all the other parties, whether it's the Conservative CDU or the Greens or the Liberals or the Social Democrats, have always clubbed together in different permutations of coalitions to keep out the AfD. They call this the firewall. Now, it's increasingly difficult to both justify that firewall when a party such as the AfD has at least a quarter of the vote nationally, and in some of the East German states has well over a third of the vote, knocking on 40% of the vote. How do you justify the democratic will when you then exclude the party and all the people that voted for it from any form of democratic representation? So that's the dilemma they face. Now, this court judgment is regarded as really quite controversial and problematic. The courts are independent, and in a way, they haven't done Merz a favor, I don't think, in doing this initial judgment, which has subsequently been suspended. Because as we know from Donald Trump, who refused to accept that he lost second time around, the far right loves nothing more than to feel aggrieved and to show that the deep state, in cahoots with the liberal elite and the media establishment, is trying to do them down and trying to keep them out of power. So in a sense, this plays exactly into the AfD playbook. What Merz has got to do now with the Social Democrats is to run the country in a way dealing with all manner of problems: economic modernization, economic growth, foreign policy, Europe, dealing with Donald Trump, dealing with migration in a way that keeps all sides on board, in a way that he will begin to gradually peel back some of the voters who voted in frustration for the AfD.
Now, we can ask whether he is able to fight the alt-right, far-right tide. Some would ask whether he's fighting it or riding it, given, for example, some of the rhetoric we've seen from Merz about migrants. What is Merz likely to mean for migration in Germany? Germany having been quite a significant immigration hub, both for economic and humanitarian reasons.
So Merz has made a big play, and he made a big play during the election campaign, that he would be extremely tough. Now, again, to what degree is he actually going to be different from the outgoing government, which, although it was composed largely of Social Democrats and Greens, really did toughen up a lot of immigration controls, starting to put physical border checks all over Germany's many borders, to the east, to the west, and to the south with other European countries. It's supposed to be free movement, but it's increasingly looking as if it isn't. So to what degree will he change things? He's certainly, I think, going to make things harder in terms of deportations, but again, they could be challenged in the courts. He is determined to deny certain categories of migrants welfare payments and to have police crackdowns, as I say, border checks, and that kind of thing. But again, to what degree is this different from elsewhere? The French government is doing the same. Keir Starmer's government in the UK is doing the same. The political weather, whether we like it or not, is moving in that direction.
When Germany's general election happened, it was right after Trump had just come in, and there's sort of high spirits among right-wing populism. Elon Musk, among Trump's senior officials, firmly endorsed the AfD. But now Trump's reputation abroad has sort of soured. We've seen this economic collapse almost in the wake of his tariffs. We've seen a lot of people become nervous about what looks like quite a crackdown on free speech in America. And it seems to have triggered a bit more anxiety about right-wing populism, for example, in Canada or Australia, and in the recent elections, which had quite surprising swings away from these increasingly popular right-wing groups. Final question. I wonder whether we might see this in Germany as well. Do we think that the Trump effect, the sort of deterrence against populist hard right groups, could play out against the AfD in Germany?
That's a really interesting question. And the AfD, Alice Weidel, the leader of the AfD, did this bizarre and excruciating in conversation with Elon Musk at the start of the election campaign. And I had the dubious pleasure of having to listen to the whole thing live for 40 minutes. And it was quite psychedelic and weird and dangerous. But the AfD are in a pickle. Certainly, so far, it hasn't showed itself up in the opinion polls. But Germany's never been... It's been very reliant on America militarily, but it's always had, a bit like France has had, it's always had a pretty double-edged relationship with America. It doesn't like an overbearing America. And so for a party to be so heavily endorsed by the American far right, will that or will it not help them in the future? At the same time, no, absolutely. Australia, through Albanese and Mark Carney's revival of the Liberal Party in Canada, are quite astonishing for their turnaround, for the extent to which people are saying we've had enough of being bossed about and threatened by Donald Trump. That is why I think Merz feels emboldened to be pretty in your face in his criticism of Trump. How those two get on will be interesting. When the court did its initial ruling against the AfD, various figures in the US administration, Marco Rubio, J.D. Vance, and others, started accusing Germany of tyranny, at which point the German foreign ministry basically told them to mind their own business. It's a kind of interesting face-off, and how that develops in coming days, weeks, and months will be one of the most interesting aspects of German policy.
Absolutely. Plenty to think about in those answers. John Campner, thank you for all of your insights.